Welcome to Higher Level Ecology. In this section, we're going to look at some ecological pyramids. We're going to look at population control and the different ecological relationships and how they affect population size. We're also going to look at population dynamics. And then in the latter part of the chapter, we're going to look at human population growth and the factors that affect the human population. So first of all, under the heading of ecological pyramids, our first example of an ecological pyramid is a pyramid of numbers. Now, a pyramid of numbers describes the number of individuals or organisms at each trophic level in your food chain. As you might expect, as you go up along the food chain from the producer to the primary consumer to the secondary consumer, etc., your numbers decrease. Also, as you go up along that food chain, the size of the organism tends to increase, so your organisms tend to get bigger as you go up. Most of that's better explained using an example. So here is our grass rabbit fox food chain, and we'll see that when we draw a pyramid of numbers for our grass rabbit fox, we'll have loads and loads of grass, so lots and lots of your producer, a very high population of producer. You'll have less rabbits, and then you'll have very much less foxes. So your pyramid is adhering to a lovely pyramid size in that you have loads of numbers on the bottom tier, loads of producers, you have less primary consumers, and you've even less secondary consumers or top consumers, as we might refer to the fox. So that gives you a nice pyramid-shaped pyramid of numbers. You might wonder, when is a pyramid not a pyramid? Well, sometimes there are slight issues with your pyramid of numbers. Your first issue is it's not the most accurate. Sometimes if you have a huge disparity between the number of producers and, say, the primary consumers, you can't draw them to scale. For instance, that last one that we looked at for grass rabbit fox certainly wasn't to scale. They don't represent the size of the organisms in any way, just the number. That's why they're called pyramids of numbers. And sometimes you can actually get a pyramid of numbers that doesn't look like a pyramid. Typical examples would be, first of all, if you have a parasitic food chain. So if you look at a parasitic food chain here, we have the grass going to the rabbit, going to the fox, but we also take into account the fox fleas. So the fox fleas are parasites living on the fox, and we would have had our nice little pyramid shape until we get to the fox fleas. Of course, there can be loads of fox fleas living on just one fox even. So that destroys the shape of our pyramid of numbers. Or another example would be where you have a very large producer, such as an oak tree. A single oak tree can have loads of greenfly living on it. And those greenfly then are food for the ladybird, which in turn is food for the spider. So you'll notice here, instead of having a nice pyramid, we have a very thin bottom layer, showing that the number at our producer trophic level here is very small, in fact just one in this case. So neither of these give us our nice pyramid shape for our pyramid of numbers. There is a solution to that, and that's to use a different type of ecological pyramid, and that type of ecological pyramid is called a pyramid of biomass. As the name suggests, this takes into account the actual mass or the amount of live matter at each trophic level, not just the number of organisms, but the weight essentially of organisms, the amount of matter. There are two measures that you can use, either the live weight or the dry matter, which is when the organisms have been killed and dried out. Your pyramid of biomass has one essential advantage. It will always give you the right shape, because if you look, we'll say at the oak tree example, even though there was only one oak tree, if you look at the mass of the oak tree, the mass of that oak tree will always be bigger than the mass of green flies on the second trophic level, which in turn will, the mass of the green flies will always be bigger than the mass of the ladybirds that are eating them, and the mass of ladybirds will be bigger than the mass of spiders that could eat them. So the biomass takes into account not just the number of organisms, but the mass that they would have if they were all weighed. So if the full population of ladybirds was taken into account and you were able to weigh each one of them, they would weigh a lot more than the weight of the spiders that will eat them. Similarly, when you look at your parasitic food chain, you'll have a much higher biomass of grass than you will have of rabbits, and a much higher biomass of rabbits than you will have of foxes. And even though there's loads and loads of fleas living on the fox, because they're so tiny, when you add up the biomass that's involved here, the weights of all those fox fleas, you will find that it is still lower than the fox, as of course it would have to be. And that means that you get a nice pyramid shape with the biomass decreasing as we go up from the first to the second to the third to the fourth trophic level. Right, next we are going to look at some factors that control population size, and we're going to focus in on the different ecological relationships that happen in an ecosystem. And these relationships affect the population size of the different organisms by either affecting the birth rate or the death rate of those organisms, or maybe even both. And when we take them together, they give an overall balance in nature. Now, examples that we're going to look at of ecological relationships are competition, predation, parasitism, and symbiosis. So these are all essentially biological factors that affect the size of the different populations in a particular ecosystem or habitat. So first of all, competition. Resources in nature can tend to be scarce, and this creates a competition between plants and animals. When there is a competition between plants and animals for resources that are scarce, the plants and animals have to adapt in order to give themselves advantages in that competition. And these adaptations are widely regarded as the wonders of nature. So, what is competition then? So, competition is when organisms actively struggle for a resource that is in short supply. That's our definition of competition. When organisms actively struggle for a resource that is in short supply. So, what do we mean by a resource? We mean a thing that they need. That could be food, it could be shelter, it could be space, it could be light. What is the result of this competition? So to go back to, remember we're considering here, how does it affect the population of organisms? Well, generally, competition in that sense is not a good thing. It tends to reduce the population. The more competition there is, the more death of organisms there will be. So if there's more death rate, then you are going to reduce the population. Some examples: plants compete for light, space, water, and minerals in the soil. Animals tend to compete for food primarily, but also for shelter, for partners to mate with, and for territory as well. Now let's look at this in a little bit more depth. So there are two different types of competition. There's intra-specific competition and inter-specific competition. Now, intra versus inter, you may have come across this lingo before in your social, personal, and health education. You might have talked about intra and inter in the context of looking at yourself and your self-awareness. So if you are a person that has a very inward looking nature and good self-knowledge, that is deemed to be good at looking at intrapersonal relationship, so getting to know yourself, whereas interpersonal relationships are where you get to know other people. In this case, when we're talking about competition, intra again refers to within. So intraspecific is within one species. It's members of the same species fighting with each other, whereas interspecific is members of different species competing with each other. So intraspecific competition examples would include two stags competing for a partner. So they want to mate with the partner and they have a good old contest or a fight to find out who's going to get that partner. Plants, you might not think of plants having a particular contest for resources, but they do. Two dandelions, for instance, will compete for light, so they both need light. Intraspecific competition tends to be worse than interspecific competition. Why? Because if you take the dandelions, for example, the dandelions have the exact same needs. They need the same amount of light, they need water from the same part of the soil, they have the same space requirement. Same for your stags, they need partners, the same partners, they need all of the same food types. So that intraspecific, that within one species competition tends to be a sharper or edgier competition than the alternative, which is the interspecific competition. So let's now focus in on the interspecific competition, which means competition between members of different species. And examples of this would include a blackbird and a thrush that are competing for snails, and maybe a dandelion and some grass competing for water. Not that particular water that looks like Evian, but soil water. And generally speaking, if we look at that first example there of your blackbird versus your thrush for the snails, that's one thing that they're competing for, but they're not competing for other things like partners, and in fact they may have other sources of food that aren't in common with each other. So as I said, this is not quite as tough a competition as you will have for the intraspecific competition. Similarly, your dandelions and your grass, yes, they're both competing for water, but because they're not the same species, they are adapted in different ways to get their water. The dandelion, for example, has a long tap root that goes down centrally from the stem, and that can access water at quite deep levels, whereas your grass tends to have many fibrous roots that will spread out and cover a greater surface area near the surface of the soil. So they can coexist to some extent and both get water. Now that brings us to another two terms that come up under the heading of competition. So far we've had our intraspecific, meaning within a species, and interspecific, meaning between two different species. Now we have contest competition versus scramble competition, and the explanations of these two different terms are fairly obvious from the name. So contest competition is where there's an actual physical fight for the resource. So if you go back to those stags that we were looking at earlier, they were actively fighting for a mate. The result of contest competition is that one organism gets the resource and the other doesn't. If we look at the stags, the victorious stag gets the mate, the other one doesn't get it. Examples would include robins. So when we hear beautiful robin song, that is actually a warning from one male robin to another to stay out of his territory. He's getting all that territory, the other guy is not being allowed in to share. Red squirrels will actually fight physically for mates as well, and a male cat will protect his territory by fighting or by using a very strong smell, leaving his smell all over his territory. And in all of these cases, one individual is getting all of the resource and the other is getting nothing. So it's an all or nothing contest competition. Scramble competition, on the other hand, is when you have a whole lot of organisms in competition for a scarce resource and they all get a part of it. So they all get a bit of it. It's shared, if you like. However, the possible result of this would be that maybe none of them get enough of it. And an example of that would be if you plant your seedlings too close together. So if you don't spread out, for instance, your carrot seeds when you're setting them, if you don't spread out your carrot seeds enough, then the carrots will all grow kind of on top of each other, and none of them will get enough light or water or minerals or space, and you'll get poor growth. There's obviously a solution to that. You can thin out the carrots that look kind of weak, and that'll give more space to the stronger carrots to grow on after a little while. But that's more of a horticultural concern. To get back to the scramble competition, the problem with your bed of seedlings, if they are too close together, they're all in a scramble competition to try and get the space, the light, the water, etc. And actually none of them might get enough, and they might not grow that well. Young birds would be another example, an animal example. Quite often we find that not all of the young birds that hatch go on to survive, and that's because they all want food, and their parent will divide it up as evenly as possible, so they're all getting some food, but generally at least some of them won't get enough. Now, how can your animals and plants deal with this competition or give themselves an edge? Well, generally they do that by adaptations. Animals and plants are adapted to avoid competition or to give themselves a benefit in competition. They can be adapted by their feeding habit, by having protective coats or adapted mouth parts. Just an example on that adapted mouth parts that you may be familiar with would be on the Galapagos Islands. When Darwin was studying evolution, he would have noticed the finches, and there were different finches with different mouth parts, and each of those mouth parts, each of those beaks was a different shape in order to allow them to eat different foodstuffs. And that was an adaptation that occurred, he deemed, over time, and gave them an advantage in nature, and was therefore passed on from adults to young in successive generations. So that's how an adaptation works. If it gives a benefit, then the organism that has that adaptation will survive for longer. If it survives for longer, it gets to do more reproduction, and it passes on the benefit or the adaptation to future generations. Other examples then from the animal kingdom would include your greenfly, which obviously has camouflage going for it, which makes it more difficult to spot on leaves, as does a caterpillar, as you can see over there on the right in the picture. A rabbit has good hearing, nice big ears and good hearing, and that allows him to hear a predator coming. He's also quite a fast runner. A fox has good smell, eyesight, nice strong legs, and a bushy tail to help it to run fast as well. The tail gives it good balance, which helps it to run fast when it is pursuing its prey. And then from the plant kingdom, your dandelions, I already mentioned, have their taproot, which grows down quite deep into the soil to access water. And your nettles, of course, will sting, and that protects them from being eaten. Now, that all came under the heading of competition, which, as we mentioned, is a factor that has an impact on a population living in an ecosystem. A second factor that impacts on the population size is predation. And predation is when an organism catches, kills, and eats another organism. So we're talking here about our predator-prey relationship. So the predator is the animal that kills the other animal and eats it. Examples would be your lion, your hawk, your ladybird. Your ladybird, for instance, has the adaptation in the mouth parts that allows it to eat aphids. Your hawk has excellent eyesight, and your lion is quite fast, and all of those things help them to be successful predators. And then the prey, that's the organism that's killed and eaten. Examples there would be your gazelle, your blackbird, your mouse, and your aphid. adaptations there. If we focus in on the mouse, for instance, the mouse can run a lot faster than its predator, so it would use its quick running to evade a cat. What is the result of predation? Well, it has a fairly obvious effect on the population. It will decrease the population of the prey. However, that's oversimplifying it a little bit. In reality, what you tend to see in your predator-prey relationship is a cyclical sort of a relationship. And this is referred to as population dynamics, which is the relationship between the predator population and the prey population. Let's take the example of the green fly, which handily enough is shown by this green line on our graph, and the ladybird population, which is shown by the red line on the graph, red, just like your ladybirds. We're comparing here a graph of time, so we're looking at the passage of time and what's going to happen to the number of organisms. That's the population of your aphids or greenfly, that's the green one, and what's happening at the same time to the population of the ladybirds. So if we look at the start of the graph, so we're in this new area, and we initially see the prey start to build up. So we have a relatively low population, first of all, of the greenfly, but they start to flourish. They have some nice new food, we will say. So some lovely leaves to feed on, and the greenfly reproduce at a good rate, and their population starts to go up. Now, when that population goes up to a certain height, we will find that ladybird population will start to increase as well, because the more greenfly you have, the more food there is for the ladybirds. So there's a slight lag in the time, if you notice. So the ladybird curve is also always coming that little bit after the greenfly curve, because there has to be more greenflies than there are ladybirds, because each ladybird is going to need to eat a number of greenfly. You will also notice that the peak of this graph for the greenfly is always higher than the ladybird, because the ladybird population, since they eat aphids, the ladybird population can never exceed or be higher than the greenfly population. There always has to be more food than there are consumers of that food. So when we've reached a certain critical aphid population or greenfly population, there are so many ladybirds there that the aphids start to be killed off and their population starts to decrease. Now, once their population starts to decrease, you'll find after a slight time lag, the ladybirds will start to suffer from not having enough food and their population will decrease, except of course theirs will plummet to a much lower level than the aphid population. So again, there's a slight time lag between the decrease in numbers of the aphids or greenfly and the decrease in numbers of the ladybird. And the ladybird numbers will go down much lower than the greenfly population. But when the ladybird population has dropped enough, the few remaining aphids, they won't ever be wiped out, because eventually there are so few of them living in the habitat that they can hide out, essentially. So they've loads of hiding places, and when they're hiding out in those little hiding places, they have a chance for their population to recover. That leads to their numbers going up again, and the ladybirds have been virtually wiped out at this stage because they've no food, or maybe some of them have taken off to a new area because there just isn't enough food here. But eventually, as the greenfly population goes up, the ladybird population will also go up with, again, that slight time lag. The most common question on this is to actually draw the graph, and what they'll be looking for if you are asked to draw the graph is to have this up and down, and show at least 2 cycles for your greenfly, and the same for the ladybird. And the ladybird goes again up and down for 2 cycles, but the ladybird graph is shifted to the right because it comes after the greenfly. It never goes up as high as the greenfly, and it always goes down lower than the greenfly. And they'll also be looking for the correct labels. So this is the passage of time happening on the x-axis, and up the side is the number of organisms, and your greenfly is the prey, so its graph goes higher, and your ladybird is the predator, so its graph doesn't go quite as high. So just to summarise that, we start out with a certain number of prey first, then come the predators. As the predator numbers go up, the prey numbers start to go down. Then there isn't enough food for the predators and their numbers start to go down as a result. When the predator numbers get nice and low, the prey start to recover and their number goes up and the cycle begins again. Now, factors that might influence this predator-prey relationship, this population dynamics that we see between the predator and the prey in that lovely graph. Well, first of all, the amount of food available. If there's lots of food, the predator numbers go up. If there isn't much food, as in if the prey are nearly all gone, the predator numbers go down. Concealment, which I think I mentioned, the prey never get totally wiped out because when their population is low enough, they can actually hide out easier from the ladybirds. And then also the movement of prey. The predators do tend to move on. If there isn't enough prey to eat, then the predators will just leave the area because they can't get enough food. Once they've left the area, this allows for an increase again in the prey. They don't have predators that are killing them, so they have a chance for their population to recover. Now, what adaptations might we associate with this? Well, some of these have been mentioned already. Predators tend to have excellent sight or hearing or smell, any of the senses that would help them to detect the prey. Maybe they might have specialised mouth parts like your ladybird that's adapted to eat the aphid. Or maybe they might have camouflage, so they might blend into their environment, and you find that with your badger. What about the prey then? Well, the prey might have needles, spines, spikes, camouflage, they might be able to run fast, or they might have warning coloration, which is one that we haven't mentioned before. You see there in your butterfly, this butterfly has a coloration that looks like huge eyes on it and makes it look like it's a much bigger organism than it actually is. So when its predator looks, it might see those eyes and think, whoa, this is something big, and not go after it. Or if you look at holly, the adaptation, and now we're delving into plant adaptations rather than predator-prey per se, but if you look at holly, holly has a spiky leaf but also has red berries, and that red colour generally in nature is what's regarded as a warning coloration. Most things think if they see a red colour, no, I'll avoid that. It's going to be either poisonous or at the very least it's not going to taste very good. Just to mention there that the caterpillar is in there because of the camouflage, and the little mouse is in there because he can run fast to evade his predator. Now, so we've covered so far our competition and our predator-prey relationship. The next factor that we're going to look at that affects population size is parasitism. A parasite, I'm sure you have a general understanding of the word parasite, is an organism that lives on or in another organism and gets food from it. There are two types, either an ecto or an endoparasite, and we've come across those prefixes a few times in our biology course so far. Ectoparasites live on the outer surface or skin of the host, and endoparasites live inside the host. So examples of your ectoparasites might be your fleas, for instance living on a dog, or endoparasites, your examples if you're in an agricultural context might include liver fluke, or tapeworms in humans are also an endoparasite. The results of parasitism. Now, you might think that these other organisms living on or in an organism from a different species might wipe it out, but they tend not to. Usually the parasite is much smaller than the host, and it has a kind of a difficult life, so its numbers don't ever get all that huge, and it tends to not cause that much damage to the host. Why? Because if it did, it would lose its place to live, it would lose its source of food. So overall, the effect that the parasite has on the population is only a very small reduction. in the population of the host, um, because it tends not to want to kill it and get rid of its own home. Now, the last one that we're going to look at is symbiosis. So, symbiosis, a symbiotic relationship in the general sense of the word, is you scratch your back, you scratch my back, and I'll scratch yours, which means that there's a benefit for two individuals going on here. In biology, it's a little bit more complicated than that. Symbiosis in the biological sense refers to two organisms from different species living in close proximity or close association with each other, with at least one of them benefiting. So, not quite the same as the more general use of the term where everybody benefits. Now, there are examples of symbiosis. They're divided up into three. We have mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. Now, mutualism is very similar to the English use of the word symbiosis. It's what we tend to think of as symbiosis. Both species are benefiting from the relationship. So, what's the result? If both species are benefiting, then the population of both species goes up, it increases. And an example of this one would be the bacteria in our own large intestine. They get somewhere to live and they get a source of food. We get vitamins from them, our B group vitamins and vitamin K. So that's mutualism, which, as I said, is the one that's most similar to the normal use of the word symbiosis in your general use of the word. Another example of symbiosis is commensalism. Now, in this case, one species is getting a benefit and the other species is not getting a benefit, but there's no harm being done to it either, so it's not really affected. What's going to happen in terms of population here? Well, the species that's getting the benefit, its population is going to increase, and the other population isn't really going to be affected. And an example would be barnacles living on a whale. The barnacles are getting transport. The whales not getting anything, but it's not doing them any damage either. Now, that brings us to the end of the factors that affect population. So the four factors that we looked at there were competition, predator-prey, parasitism, and finally we looked at symbiosis. Now we're going on to look at human population growth, and this is the last section of the chapter. So humans, of course, are a species, and we may look at the population of humans as well. If we consider population growth since records began, we get a graph that looks something like this. So we see that in our early history, the human population was increasing at a very slow rate, but that in recent years, the population growth, the rate of growth has gone up, has gone up massively. So the slope has gone up massively in this curve. I should mention that that's the number of people on Earth in billions there. So to summarize the stats that we see there, around 200,000 years ago, humans first appeared on Earth, or at least that's when we believe they first appeared on Earth. From 1 AD to 1650, there was a small increase in human population, under 600 million. Now, if we skip on forward then to 1930, the human population had reached over 2,000 million. In 1970, the human population was over 4,000 million, but by 2000, the human population was over 6,000 million. Now, currently, our population is increasing at a rate of 75 million per year globally, which equates to 205,000 per day, or 143 every minute. So when they say there's one born every minute, there might only be one mug born every minute, but there's roughly 143 babies born every minute. Incidentally, that's slightly less than it would have been maybe 10 years ago, you could have been looking at about 80 to 83 million per year at that stage. What are the factors that affect human population growth? So remember, we looked at factors like competition, symbiosis, etc. when we were talking about other animals. But what about humans? So the human population, again, we look at the birth rate and the death rate. And if the birth rate and death rate were to stay the same, then the population will be stable. So any factor that's going to impact on the human population is either going to affect the birth rate or the death rate. Our population is increasing at the moment because the death rate is decreasing. We're not actually having any increase in birth rate. If anything, our birth rate is declining, certainly in the developed world, but we are having an impact on our death rate because of better medicines, better technologies, certainly better food, and more clean water in more different parts of the world. So if we are hitting that death rate and decreasing it, then overall our population is increasing. So what are the factors that affect the birth or death rates? We're going to look at 4 of them. We're going to look at war, famine, contraception, and disease. So first of all, war. The effect that war has on population is fairly obvious. It decreases population. Sorry, slight typo on the slide there. It decreases population. For example, the Second World War, 22 million are estimated to have died. So that's a significant decrease in the world population. However, often just straight after the war, there's a rise in the birth rate. This is referred to as a baby boom, as all those soldiers are reunited with their partners and everyone's feeling delighted, a spirit of rebirth at the end of the war. Then that brings us to famine then. Famine affects the death rate. Obviously, if there's a lack of food, there will be death due to hunger and also death due to disease. For instance, in the Great Famine in Ireland in 1845 to 1847, 2 million died. In the modern era, because of developments in agriculture and in technology, we actually have enough food in the world to feed everyone, but we still have a problem with distribution of food. And because there are some areas that have excesses of foods and some areas of the world that are badly in need of food, we still have a situation where approximately 15 million people die every year due to hunger. Then the third factor that affects the human population is contraception. So in the last 50 years or so in the developed world, we've had much greater availability of contraceptives. Contraceptives being methods that you use to prevent conception, so methods that are used to prevent pregnancy. In Ireland in 1850, the average number of children per household was 8.2, which is scary. By 1950, that had fell to 4.2 children per household. In 1992, that was 2.1 children per household. By 2002, it was just 1.6 children per household. So fertility is decreasing all over the world, and that means that the population, the human population, should be decreasing, but as we've said earlier, because of our technological developments and our better food and our better water, the death rate is also decreasing, and the death rate is decreasing at a much higher rate than the birth rate, and therefore our population overall is still increasing. And finally, disease. And you might recognise the picture on the side there, the dreaded COVID-19 virus. Disease reduces the population. We've developed a lot of vaccines down through the years, and those vaccines have led to reductions in diseases like polio, TB, which was all but stamped out, Going back maybe 10 years ago, we ran out of TB vaccine in Ireland, and we used to routinely vaccinate and give even booster shots against TB. But when we ran out of the vaccine, we looked around and said, oh, it's all but stamped out in the world. We don't need to keep going with this vaccination program. And interestingly, at the very start of the discussion about the coronavirus, it was put forward that some countries where they had routine vaccine for TB had lower instances of serious COVID-19 cases than others. Now, I don't know if that's been since kind of discredited, but anyway, vaccine use has led to reductions in polio, TB, and cholera, some of those being virtually wiped out entirely. Antibiotics as well have led to a decrease in disease. Um, as we said, disease leads to a reduction in population, but one would hope that for every disease there is a vaccine, and we will eventually find that vaccine for COVID-19, hopefully on time for the next year of schooling. And that wraps up our higher level ecology. And the next chapter to look at under ecology will be an actual study of an ecosystem. Um, so we leave it there for now.